Although we have been called Christians since the middle of the first century, the first designation, the first name for the Christian community in the very beginning was the people of the way. We are a pilgrim people. We journey with Jesus, and it is during our journey together that our eyes are opened and we recognize the one who goes ahead of us. We keep our eyes fixed firmly on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of our faith. Our pilgrimage journey to Rome and Assisi began October 13th. We arrived bright-eyed and ready to go in Rome at the airport. We spent 4 days in Rome, and then last Saturday we went up to Assisi, the home of St. Francis and St. Clare. On Monday we went to Siena, the town of Catherine of Siena, and then we drove 6 hours to the south of Italy, to Sorrento, arriving in the evening after dark. Tuesday morning, we took a ferry to the Isle of Capri. It's the only day that we had rain, part of the day. And then Wednesday morning, we got up early and drove along the Amalfi coast. We passed the beautiful mountain village of Positano. And from there, we stopped at Pompeii, the village that was covered in volcanic ash near the end of the first century. And then from there, we started back to Rome. We had about a 3 or 4 hour bus ride to get to the restaurant where we're going for dinner. Now, our guide, Paola, she was a short little Italian woman, and it was her job to make sure that all the details fell into place, and she'd always be calling ahead to make sure that the next event was ready. And so she was checking with the restaurant where we're going for dinner, and she was sort of lamenting the fact that she says, tour groups love to have their last day and go out, get dressed up and go out for a nice dinner on their last day of the tour. She said, unfortunately, because we'll be traveling all day and we'll get to Rome late, there won't be time to stop at our hotel and change. She said, well, we'll just have to show up. We'll look like homeless people. Well, we didn't look all that shabby, but we were not dressed to the nines, that's for sure. The Wednesday before, we went to the papal audience in St. Peter's Square, and that day we were dressed for rain. There was an 80% chance of rain in Rome that day. It did not rain, sprinkled a little bit. After a while, I began to suspect that the weather forecasts are a lot like the driving laws in Italy. They're just suggestions. It's not exactly what's going to happen. There were some people, though, who were present for the papal audience who were not dressed in their rain gear. You'll recognize them by their unique attire. There were many newlyweds who were present for the papal audience. And every week at the papal audience, the Pope welcomes the newlyweds, and they have special seating for them up close to the Pope. But they have to be dressed appropriately. They have to be wearing their bridal attire. In fact, there was a couple that came in late, and they sat up in the row just in front of us, she in her wedding dress, and he in a tuxedo, and it had sprinkled a little bit, so I handed her a Kleenex so she could wipe the seat dry before she sat down. But even before she sat down, an usher spotted them and came and escorted them up to the place where the newlyweds were to sit. The clothing tells us a lot about our position. It tells something about who we are. And in this story about Bartimaeus, there's something about clothing that's significant here. Bartimaeus is sitting beside the road. He's not on the way. He's not on the road with Jesus and his disciples and the large crowd. He's beside the road, begging. But when he hears that Jesus is passing by, he calls out to him. Now, the disciples, just like they tried to stop the people who were bringing little children to Jesus, tried to stop him from shouting out. But he persisted. He kept shouting, Jesus, Son of David, have pity on me. So Jesus stops when he hears him. And he tells his disciples, call him here. And so now the disciples repeat the words that Jesus told them. And he says to them, courage, get up, take heart, Jesus is calling you. But notice what Bartimaeus does. He springs to his feet and he throws off his cloak. Even before he receives his sight, he gives away the one thing that he has. He throws off his garment, which is the cloak of the blind beggar. He's letting go of his old life so that he's ready to receive a new life. He gives away the one thing that he has before he receives his sight. This is in contrast to the story of the rich young man we heard just a few weeks ago. He couldn't do the one thing that Jesus asked, go and sell what you have and give to the poor, and then come and follow me. And he went away sad because he had many possessions. He could not follow Jesus. Bartimaeus is ready to give up everything because he only desires the one thing. Teacher, I want to see again. The story takes place as Jesus is leaving Jericho. Jericho is the last town at the bottom of the hill to Jerusalem. And Jesus is on his way to Jerusalem and to the cross. But he takes the time to stop and call the man who is sitting beside the road. That's because even though Jesus is on his way to Jerusalem to give away his life in love, he does not go there alone. He stops to include all those who are left behind, to welcome the outcast. Just as Jesus welcomed the little child who had absolutely nothing to give and everything to receive. When Pope Francis arrived in St. Peter's Square, the audience was quite excited, of course. Everybody jumped to their feet and then jumped up on top of their chairs. Everybody had cameras taking pictures and waving as the Pope went by. It was pretty exciting when he first entered into the square. As he went around the various places, this was close to us. And I love this picture. You can barely see the Pope there, but notice all the young people are waving to him. Not only do they want to see him, they want him to see them as well. He goes smiling, blessing the people as he goes. People are waving back. But what was even more impressive, as we waited in St. Peter's Square, you had to get there early, and of course the earlier, the better chance of getting the better seats. But rather unexpectedly, before the Pope came into the square for the audience, he appeared on, they had these big jumbo screens in St. Peter's Square, and he appeared on the screen. And he was talking to some people it turns out they were in the Paul VI audience hall. So there's a hall that seats 10,000 people for when it's a rain day in Rome. And so that day, he welcomed the handicapped. They were all assembled in the Paul VI assembly hall. And so he went there first. And it was, he just came on screen. He said, well, I welcome you here. He said, we were worried it was going to rain and we didn't want you to get wet. So he said, just relax, have a coffee. Maybe they'll bring you a coffee. He said, I don't know. And then this little boy was kind of wandering up there. And he said, well, what do you want? And so the little boy went and got his mother and then came up and the Pope blessed him. And pretty soon the children came. And then he went all around Paul VI audience hall and touched the handicapped. And they were touching him. Of course, we were watching. We were watching all of this because the Pope was teaching us. He was showing us how this is done. And then to the audience here in the Papal Square, St. Peter's Square, he said he blessed the people in the Paul VI audience hall. He said, have courage and bless them. He said, now I want you to know that we are only one audience. You are part of the group that's out in the square. And surely we did feel connected because of that experience. He began not with us first, but he started with the outsiders, the ones who are usually left out. During our time in Rome, the Synod on the family was continuing. In fact, it just ended today. The Pope had a Mass this morning to close the Synod. And Archbishop Blaise Suppisch from Chicago was a delegate to the Synod. The word Synod means to journey together. And like every journey, it has its ups and downs. There was tensions all along the way. But last weekend, Bishop Suppisch was giving an interview to some reporters, And he was talking about a way that the church could find a path to balance the need to affirm church teaching while struggling to reach out to those who are left out. And he gave an interesting insight. He said his mother was once asked if she loved one of her 9 children more than the others. And she responded, only if they need it. Bishop Supic says that's the way mothers speak. And he said that's the way the church needs to speak to families, especially those who feel excluded or in need of extra attention. At the same time, he said, the Catholic Church cannot accompany and integrate and reconcile people whom it does not know and with whom it is incapable of communicating. He said if we're really going to accompany people, we have to first of all engage them, whether they are the elderly or the divorced and remarried, the gay and lesbian individuals or couples. He said, I think we need to really get to know what their life is like if we're going to accompany them. When we were in Rome, we had an opportunity to visit the Sant'Egidio community, and we went for evening prayer on Friday night at Santa Maria in Trastevere. The Sant'Egidio community was established in Rome in the 60s. I first encountered them when I went to Belgium a couple of years ago to study. We went to Antwerp to spend an afternoon and evening with the Sant'Egidio community. It's a lay Christian community, and their ministry is to make friends with the poor, to accompany the poor in their journey in life. And they have this special ministry, and they come together for evening prayer every night of the week. It's about a half-hour prayer. So one of the things they do is they run restaurants for the poor. We call them soup kitchens. They operate hotels. We would call them shelters. He says they want to become friends, to accompany, to make friends with the poor. They care for refugees in every city where they find them all over Europe. And they have a very special ministry for the most excluded group in the world, the prisoners on death row. They're leaders in an international campaign to end the death penalty everywhere in the world. After the papal audience was over, the sun did come out, and we were leaving with the 10,000 of us leaving the St. Peter's Square. It was a very Catholic experience. People from every corner of the globe were there, and the messages were translated in the various languages you can imagine. There was Polish and German and French and Portuguese, even Arabic was one of the priests there spoke. Our guide, Paula, was rather short, and so she would hold up, you can see there, the yellow plastic rose. That was Paula going ahead of us, holding up the rose so we could follow and not get lost on the way. Just like Jesus, the great high priest who goes before us. Like all high priests, Jesus too is beset by weakness, and so then he can sympathize with our weakness. We keep our eyes fixed on Jesus, who holds the cross high before us. And we, like Bartimaeus, who was sitting beside the road, are now on the road, knowing that the path we walk is the path that Jesus has taken before us. It is a path through death to life.